Um, really exciting to be here. I've only been at USAID for about 2 years now, but I spent a number of years in the NGO community, so it's great to be back and see some familiar faces and not just be enmeshed in government bureaucracy for a couple of hours anyways. Um, this is not one of those exciting presentations at the adaptation community about really exciting work that's happening on the ground and all that great stuff that you guys are doing, but I do think that these changes that are happening within the US government and within USAID are pretty exciting in a different way and really represent a fundamental shift in how we're moving forward with international development. So I only have a few things to share with you, and hopefully we can have a little bit of a conversation. But I did want to give a bit of an update on where we are with USAID's adaptation plan, and also how we're responding to the number of executive orders that have been coming out as of late. So starting with the adaptation plan, there you can see our beautiful document. This has been available online since October. So if you're interested in getting down into the nitty-gritty details, you're welcome to download it. It's pretty easy to find if you just Google USAID Adaptation Plan, and there's a link for those of you who are online. We've been producing an adaptation plan annually since 2012. And when we produced that first plan in 2012, we also did a bit of an analysis of vulnerability at USAID, including looking at vulnerability in I think about 25 different countries where we're working. So there's still some value in looking at that plan if you're interested in that analysis. But in this most recent plan, what was really exciting about that was we used the plan in part to respond to a new executive order that was issued in November of 2013 called Preparing the United States for the Impacts of Climate Change, that called on all US government agencies to do more to adapt to climate change, not just in our operations, which I think a lot of people had been talking about for quite a while, but also in terms of our ability to achieve our mission objectives. And so USAID used the adaptation plan process as an opportunity to look at what are the fundamental opportunities to really adapt to climate change, make sure our programs are able to adapt to climate change. And I think our fundamental goal was really, how do we make climate change adaptation a normal part of doing business at USAID? So in order to pull together this adaptation plan, we engaged in a cross-bureau process. We engaged, I think, pretty much every bureau in the agency to look at what were the key opportunities to really ramp up what we were doing in terms of climate change adaptation across the agency's work. And as a result of that, we came up with 35 priority actions, which is actually quite a lot. And so we've been very busy since then figuring out how we're actually going to implement all of those things. As I looked at those 35 actions, we were looking for actions in a number of different categories because we recognize that there are a lot of different ways in which to think about how we can do a better job of adapting to climate change. So we looked at guidance and tools, we looked at training and capacity building, at procurement, at our facilities, at incentives, at outreach, and at research and evaluation. So I think you can see that we really had a broad range of types of activities that really tackle this problem from a number of different directions. And just to give you some examples of the type of actions that you'll find if you want to actually read our adaptation plan, and to give you a flavor for how we're tackling this, I wanted to provide a few examples. So one is we're working to provide a standard language on climate change that USAID staff could voluntarily include as they're doing project designs, as they're doing putting together solicitations. And the basic idea here is USAID staff are experts in a lot of different fields of international development, but a lot of staff don't necessarily have climate change expertise. So how can we help staff who don't have climate change expertise to still think about climate change? And one idea is by providing them with standard things that they can do that tend to be broadly applicable, that can help them ensure that implementing partners are able to address climate change as they move forward with the implementation of projects, et cetera. So that's one of the things we're working on. We're also working with our Bureau Environment officers to integrate climate change considerations into Reg 216. Reg 216 is our environmental compliance requirements. And that's something we've been working on actually for a while. There's pretty good scope to work on to bring in climate change adaptation and mitigation considerations through our environmental compliance procedures, which look at both how our projects impact the environment, but also the constraints that the environment might place on our projects. So there's a lot of different ways that we can look at climate change through the environmental compliance process, and we want to be able to do a better job of doing that. We see that as a great entry point for helping people as they're doing project design to think about climate change and to identify areas where they might want to think a little bit more about climate change. We're looking at providing incentives. We recognize that doing anything with an integrated approach, being more holistic, trying to bring in multiple perspectives is not easy, and there tend to be additional upfront burdens in terms of figuring out how to do that well. So when you have USAID staff who might be very stretched for time, et cetera, we want to make sure that there's not just a burden, even though we know that projects will be better in the end when you do these types of integrated approaches. If it's overly burdensome, it'll be challenging for people to do that. So we want to provide incentives to encourage them to think about climate change. We're also working to provide climate change training to non-environment staff. This is another one that we've been doing for some time, but are continuing to ramp up. Again, just having environment staff at USAID understand and know how to react to climate change is not going to be sufficient if we're going to mainstream climate change efforts across our work. So that's another area that we're working on. Specifically, we're working to train Food for Peace partners. Food for Peace is USAID's major food assistance program. It includes both development assistance and humanitarian assistance. And the basic idea is that even in those types of projects, we want to make sure that we're able to utilize and promote climate-smart agriculture techniques. So as you can see, we have some broad kind of ideas as well as some sector-specific ideas. Another sector-specific idea is we recently have undertaken a construction assessment to better understand the agency's construction efforts, which aren't always big infrastructure procurements, but oftentimes are nested, for example, in health or education programs. And so we've been learning more about how the agency is engaging in construction, and as we figure out how we want to move forward from that, one of the things we want to think about much more carefully is how do we make sure that climate change is taken into account, because we know that infrastructure and climate change are so linked, and climate impacts can have a big effect on infrastructure. So those are a few examples, and I think it gives you a flavor of what we're working on under the Adaptation Plan. As I said, you can read more if you want to download the document. The other area that I wanted to talk to you guys about today is after we spent a lot of time working across the entire agency to come up with 35 different action items that are keeping us very busy right now, in September of 2015, President Obama issued another executive order at the UN Climate Summit that was specifically on international development. It's called Climate Resilient International Development. And it requires the integration of climate change resilience into all US government efforts related to international development. And it has some specific requirements under it. For example, it requires US government agencies engaged in international development to assess and evaluate climate change risks and vulnerabilities across our strategies, planning, programs, facilities, basically everything that we do. And then based on those assessments and evaluations, we are to adjust those strategies, programs, planning, et cetera, in order to address the climate risk that we identify. We're also called on to support developing countries to integrate climate change into their own development, planning, and actions. And finally, of course, we have to report on what we are doing. In particular, we have to report on the proportion of our programs and investments that identify, for which climate risk assessments have been done, and the proportion for which climate risk was identified and acted upon. So we are working hard now to figure out how to do all of those things. We have established another cross-agency working group to figure out exactly how we are going to develop processes for climate risk screening, to make the adjustments that are needed, and to monitor those efforts. There's also been established, or in the executive order, an interagency working group was also established, which USAID gets to chair alongside the Department of Treasury. And that interagency working group is basically supporting the efforts of all of the different agencies engaged in international development to be able to implement this executive order. Let's see. By October 1st of this year, we are going to have a process in place at some level in order to carry this out. So that's not a lot of months at a place like USAID, a very large agency, to figure out how we're going to do this, to roll it out, to make sure people are trained up, to be able to begin implementing in October. But we will have something in place in October. More likely than not, it's something that we will continue to build on and develop. But we're really excited to be moving forward with that. Our basic idea at USAID is that we want to integrate whatever process that we come up with into our normal program cycle, so that it's an integrated part of what USAID does. We're very cognizant of the fact that we don't want to be adding a lot of burden to the international development process. The whole goal is to be improving international development results. So we're very mindful of that. At this stage, most likely the climate risk screening process will be applied at both the strategy level and at the project design level. But we're really still figuring all of these things out. I assume most people here have a basic idea of what climate risk screening is, but just in case, this is something that's becoming more common in international development processes. We're seeing it in particular at the multilateral development banks are beginning to institute climate risk screening procedures. The basic idea is it's a basic check. Like a health screening or any other type of screening that you might see, where you want to know if you're in good health or if there's an area that you might need to be more concerned about and check into further and do something about. So basically what we are going to be doing is pulling in climate change information, looking at how that relates to the specific geographies that we're working in, looking at climate information related specifically to whatever sector or activities we're working in order to understand where there might be climate change risk and what we might be able to do about it. I want to also add one thing that we're very cognizant of is at a place like USAID, the goal is not to avoid climate change risk. We very much recognize that if we want to help people in developing countries, we actually need to be engaging where there is climate change risk. We just want to make sure that our international development efforts are able to address that risk so that they can be sustainable into the future. I also don't think I need to tell this group why climate change is so important for development, but clearly it intersects with all of the different sectors that we work in. And I think what we've really found is the challenge for us now is communicating that to development practitioners in those other sectors. We have practitioners in all these other sectors who have expertise in their sectors, but they may not have a lot of expertise in climate change. And being able to communicate to them and demonstrate to them how addressing climate change actually improves their ability to achieve climate change results is a really important part of integrating climate change into our development efforts. And hopefully these risk screening processes can help people in other sectors to understand why it's so important to integrate climate change and what's at risk if they don't. We're not starting from zero, luckily. As John said, climate change integration has been part of our climate change approach since the beginning of the presidential initiative. It's been a fundamental part of our strategy We do have some existing guidance. The ADS is USAID's guidance to itself. So it's the official guidance for USAID. And it does require looking at climate change in the development of our country development cooperation strategies, which are the 5-year strategies that each mission or regional mission puts into place to guide its efforts over the course of those 5 years. So we have detailed guidance that walks missions through the process of thinking about climate change in their strategy. And we're going to be building from those efforts. I think the screening process will really help us to improve what's happening under the strategy process, but hopefully also add another level at the project design process. I also want to just add that that this is an area where there's been increasing political momentum. As I said, it's been a priority since the beginning. Back in 2010, when we were starting the Climate Change Initiative, Administrator Shaw told all of the missions that he wanted to see them consider how climate change would impact their work in all of these different areas, whether or not they were receiving climate change funding. And then particularly over the course of over the last year, where we've seen the 2 executive orders, Secretary Kerry sent out his first policy guidance cable to post in March, I think, of last year, and it was devoted entirely to climate change. One of the things that he said in that policy guidance cable was that whether or not you receive climate change funding, you need to be integrating climate change considerations in your work. And obviously, climate change has been a topic that's near and dear to President Obama's heart. He spoke on this at the UN Climate Summit and continues to speak out about it. And so we're really excited to make use of this political momentum and really think about how we can do a better job of thinking about climate change, not just through our adaptation efforts and not just through our climate change mitigation efforts, but also through our general international development efforts. So that's all I really have to say. You're going to have to stay tuned to figure out what we actually end up doing about this. But I would love to take this as an opportunity to hear from those of you in the room, especially if you're from a larger international development organization, if you have any experience with integrating climate change into your international development efforts, if you've done analyses of what other large international development organizations have done to integrate climate change considerations or how they're using climate risk screening tools, we'd love to hear your ideas. So that's it.
Great, thanks, Becky. We need you to talk into the microphone, so Lily and I will chase the raised hands, because the people who are online can't hear if you don't talk into a microphone.
Sure.
So, Becky, I had a question I wanted to ask about the breakdown of the, because adaptation across the globe is a huge undertaking and, requires some kind of parsing. There's a lot of demographics out there, projections suggesting that, more than suggesting that cities are the locus of the lion's share of the population in the near future, and those trends are already underway, especially when you look at where the bulk of those people are coming from and where they're going to. It's mostly taking place in developing countries and continents like Africa. So how is that reflected in the planning, in the build-up to the planning and the investment of resources to the climate resilient development moving forward? Because those projections loom large, and if you talk to mayors of cities in many of these developing country cities, they'll tell you stories of, well, all these people, say in South Africa here, are moving from the eastern side of the country to the various cities, and we don't have anything for them to do. And yet, on the flip side of that, those people who are moving would say, I'm doing this for opportunity because there's nothing going on where I am. So Anyway, I just wanted to see what your thoughts were on, representing the agency, how the urban piece, these demographics fit into this thinking. Thank you.
That's an excellent point. Actually, 2 people over from you is my colleague, Rebecca Carter, who works specifically on urban development and climate change at USAID. So obviously, this is an area that we are looking at further. There are a lot of vulnerabilities associated with being in city. I mean, obviously, both rural communities and urban communities are vulnerable to climate change, but there are a lot of specific risks, especially because urban centers tend to be on coastlines, which have their own problems related to climate change. A lot of USAID's development efforts focus on things like urban plan. We don't tend to do a lot of big infrastructure investments. Yes, sometimes it happens, but we also do things like urban planning, and that's a great place to be thinking about how to bring in climate change considerations and in ways that can address both climate change mitigation in terms of transportation systems, et cetera, but also obviously making sure that that planning is resilient to climate impacts. Do you want to say anything, Rebecca?
I have a question from online. We've got about 27 people online, joining us online. And this question comes from Michael O'Mealy. He's from Abt Associates, based in Abbott Associates, sorry. Sorry. Thank you, I just got punched on that one. In Portland. Thanks very much, Becky. It seems like the new climate risk screening process could generate critical information to help USAID accelerate climate resilient development. What are your thoughts on the potential linkages with USAID's climate resilient development framework?
Excellent question. We actually, so those of you who are familiar with USAID's climate resilient development framework, I actually think that this framework is really perfect for mainstreaming climate change into international development. Because it doesn't just focus on how you would do specific adaptation exercises, but how you can think about what your development objectives are and how you can bring in climate change adaptation considerations. What does it mean for the risk screening? I think inherently, in some ways, climate risk screening takes a similar approach, where you're looking at what it is you're planning to do, where you're planning to do it, and then you're thinking about climate change, right? And so hopefully the climate risk screening process can help you to bring in exactly the type of information that you would need to be able to make better decisions in designing your development efforts so that they better consider climate change adaptation. So I think those things marry very well together. Yeah,
thanks. So I know it may be early for a definitive answer, but I just wanted to know about how pervasive climate risk screening will be. It sounds like you're going to use it in every project, and I wonder how binding it will be. That is, if there are negative climate implications of a project, but those are countered by positive implications in the objective for which the project was designed, how will those conflicts be adjudicated? Is there any idea of this, or of how strongly binding this will be?
I think that's one of the things that our climate risk screening process is going to have to address, is exactly, once you've done the screening, what does that imply for how you react, right? And there's obviously a lot of different ways that you might react. You might do an entirely different project, you might make small modifications, etc. But obviously, it's hard to imagine a scenario where you see, okay, let me try to think of a scenario. I guess there might be scenarios where you see very large risks over the long term, but because maybe it's a more short-term project, where the short-term benefits are very important, that you might be able to move forward. But I think one of our goals with the climate risk screening process would be that you would be considering the time scale in addition to the geography and the sector and the type of activities. So hopefully the climate risks that you would be identifying would be relevant to the projects that you have in mind. And you know, personally, I don't see if you identified those, you would want to do, I mean, it would depend on the degree of the risk, you know, that was at stake, but why would you invest in something where there was a very large risk and a chance that you weren't going to be successful? It wouldn't be a very smart use of US government resources, which is exactly why this whole process has been put into place in the first place.
Hi. Kristen,
please.
Sorry, Kristen Clay from the Nature Conservancy. Hi, Becky. I haven't seen you in a long time. So I think this is great, and I'm sure you're already thinking about this, but I wanted to offer an observation on the way that gender has been rolled out at the agency, and as a really excellent model, and to say that I've actually seen at the Conservancy the impact of the way that gender is integrated into RFAs and RFPs on our programs. Mm-hmm. So in a very positive way. And so I think, I'm sure you're talking about that, but that seems like a great example of how that this could also play out. And then the other piece is that I think there's a really great opportunity for building the evidence base. And you know, one maybe gap in the gender piece is that there are required indicators, for example, for an environmental program, to say how we're benefiting women and impacting gender, but there aren't indicators required to say how is working on gender improving conservation in our case. And I would love to see, as this gets rolled out, to be able to capture that, to actually build that evidence base of how, when you do address the risks and build in the climate resilience, how it actually leads to greater success. My assumption is that it is. So just more of a comment.
Yeah. Really helpful. We definitely have been talking a lot with gender folks at USAID to learn from their experience and to model after their experience as much as possible. And I'm very happy to report that there are a number of people at USAID who seem to say, totally unprodded, climate change is the new gender at USAID. And hopefully, you know, we can have similar success in terms of really helping people to think about this across the board in all the different areas of international development. In terms of the evidence, I agree that this is a gap, and it's a really challenging one. You know, it's something that we've pondered quite a bit, and I think some of the challenges lie around the fact of around timescales, for example. I mean, a lot of the benefits of integrating climate change may be on longer timescales than a lot of the project cycles might be on, and so it becomes very challenging to measure that. I think another challenge is the fact that, you know, the changes may be, the benefits to development results may be more qualitative than quantitative. You might not actually increase your numbers. In some cases, you might even have smaller numbers of results, but there may be a fundamental qualitative difference in the quality of those results, you know, how resilient those results are, how those people might be prepared for the future, etc. And I think those types of things are hard to capture. It's something that we're definitely thinking about. And we are developing an evaluation agenda for climate change, so this might be some of the things that we might be able to consider in that. And I think that, you know, everybody else in the adaptation community should be thinking about how they can contribute to that evidence base as well, because we would very much welcome being able to say in a more evidence-based way why these considerations are so important for international development.
Hi, Sean Martin from World Wildlife Fund. I have two questions. If you can't answer the first one, just say no, and I'll ask you the second one. Okay. Looking a little bit in the crystal ball, I'm very supportive of the whole mainstreaming idea. It's really where everyone needs to be, and something that we're trying to do at WWF as well. And I'm just wondering, as you go through this mainstreaming process, do you envision that there will be reduced funds for standalone adaptation efforts, or will the adaptation be done by the work that USAID is doing? You wanna
So, you know, I'm just a
I have
lowly
another
government
question.
employee. I'm not in charge of congressional budgets or the president's budget requests or anything like that. But I think, you know, for the folks, those of us who work on climate change at USAID, you know, we certainly would not like to see those budgets go down. We see a fundamental need for adaptation budgets and you know, whether or not those should be used on standalone climate engagements or whether they should be used to plus up our other international development efforts to help them to be more climate resilient or to contribute to climate change adaptation, which may not be exactly the same thing, is another question. But you know, I think that we definitely need both.
Thank you. I agree. I mean, the definition of adaptation has to span beyond projects and also include the mainstreaming. So I was just wondering if you're sacrificing one for the other. Thank you. If I'm allowed to ask my second question, it goes back to the, while I have the mic, it goes back to the risk question and the risk screening. And I've seen many clumsy attempts from other organizations as they try to develop risk screening tools. And I'm just wondering how you're viewing the risk. There's many ways to look at it. Is it risk from climate on the operations and implementation of the project? I've seen that. Is it risk to the outcomes that you're intending with the project, or is it risk to what the project might do to increase the risk of the communities that you're working in? So, and you just say climate risk and people interpret it as they mean. So do you have a
Yeah, I think those are really important questions, and I'm not sure we've sorted all of them out yet, but I think they're all worth thinking about. And I think this is one of the reasons why thinking about climate screening at USAID is very challenging. You know, the types of places where we are seeing more and more climate risk screening are the types of places that tend to do risk screening anyways. So it makes sense that the multilateral development banks are doing this. They do these huge loans, they do huge infrastructure investments. They tend to look at financial risk. It's such, you know, and I think a climate risk assessment can maybe easily, and I think maybe this is what you're talking about, the way that they've traditionally been designed tend to look at those types of issues. But, you know, the issues about whether or not you're introducing risk into a system, into a community, et cetera, you know, that's a much more challenging question. Whether the risk screening tool is the best way to do that, or maybe some of these efforts around environmental compliance that I mentioned, for example, where, you know, I think one of the ways to think about how is your project impacting the environment is, you know, can you be contributing to making it more challenging for a community or an ecosystem to adapt to climate change, for example, because you're withdrawing water at a time, for example, when water availability is expected to go down anyways. So, you know, there's a lot of different ways to get at those issues, but they're all really important issues for us to consider. All right.
I can see that there's momentum building on this. One of my major tasks at ACM is starting to get fairly recent. I wanted to ask about, recently I read something exactly African adaptation finance $30 billion funds. I'm curious if the finance cognizant need for funds.
Mm-hmm.
Great to promote, speak about the importance.
I'm going to get to your, Okay, I'll try my best, and I'm going to get to it in 1 second, so maybe you can help me with it. Because I want to say something first, and that is, as I said, I'm very interested to learn from those of you who may be trying to mainstream climate change at your own organizations. And I know that this is in some ways a fundamentally internal process that depends on what your internal systems and processes are. And I don't have my email address up there, but it's rchacko, C-H-A-C-K-O, @usaid.gov. And if you have ideas or lessons learned that you want to share with me, I would love to hear them. And also, it makes me wonder if this is a common challenge, if it would be worth getting a group of people together to talk about their experiences and to share those, because I think it is something that is not easy to do, and I think even organizations that have a lot of expertise in climate change, when they look at the entire organization, it's not easy to leverage that across the organization. So your question about finance was basically, there's a finance gap. The need for financing for climate change adaptation is much larger than the amount of financing that's available. And one of the ways that USAID is addressing this is we're focusing our efforts where possible on leveraging finance. So we're really aiming to see where are the opportunities to help leverage. The reality is that some of the efforts for adaptation are going to be paid by developing countries. They're already absorbing some of these costs, right? But where are the opportunities to potentially leverage public funds, whether it be from those developing countries, whether it be from other public funds, but in particular, where are there opportunities to leverage private sources of finance? And we're looking where we can to see, how is it that we can use our efforts to make sure even larger sums of finance are available, because there is a financing gap. Sure. Is there a mic for him?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question, and we do have some work that USAID is doing specifically also on the whole issue of finance readiness. So, there's the access to the money itself and the need for more money. Everybody agrees there's a gap. There's also a lot of ways in which a development agency can at least be working with our partners in developing countries to help them strategize, plan, prepare, et cetera, for the funds that are becoming available. Slowly but surely we are getting commitments to things like the GCF, the Green Climate Fund. There are other sources out there. And I think a lot of this is also about making sure that those funds are being targeted and prioritized in the ways that make the most sense for those countries, for their stakeholders, for the needs that they have. And so we have a lot of work going on with things like national adaptation plans, which are essentially vehicles to help countries make that prioritization process stick. We've just started some work on readiness in a number of countries, which I think is going to be hopefully a very promising model for that kind of support. So I think that's the other half of this. I think absolutely agreed on the money itself, but it's also about spending it well.
Okay, great, thanks. So I'm Kara Reeve with RTI International, and I think the process of climate adaptation is inherently adaptive, or at least I think it needs to be in order for us to be successful. And I think even once we understand the range of risk and a community determines what level of risk it's willing to take on, that really varies a lot by region, by country, by even some adjacent cities or communities might understand that they want to take on a different level of risk from their neighbor. And then even once we even determine what types of interventions might reduce that risk, we don't always know how they're going to perform. Sometimes they might perform in a way that we didn't anticipate, and sometimes the level of risk that we thought we were designing for is not enough or too much, et cetera. So the point is that I think that we need to understand that we need the space to innovate in maybe lower risk scenarios. But often the way that we evaluate projects is a little bit more binary. It's like, yes, no, did it work, did it not work? So I'm wondering the extent to which USAID is thinking about how we can have a more iterative process for not only evaluating projects, but also for funding. Because, you know, maybe it didn't work, a project might not work the way that we thought it might, but we might get some other value out of it, or we might need to change the direction based on how something performed. And I'm just wondering if you're thinking about how to capture that, that challenge, that grand challenge.
Obviously, that is a challenge, and I think it's, you know, particularly a challenge with, you know, USAID has its systems, it has timelines that it works over. A project is designed for X number of years, et cetera. And, you know, there's a lot of bureaucracy involved, so making changes in a project midstream are not that easy because we have an agreement with an implementing partner that, you know, entered into the whole agreement under a certain understanding, and it's not easy to go back to an implementing partner and say, well, actually now we think it'd be great to do it this way or whatever. But obviously those things do happen to some extent. And I think, you know, the challenge of integrating climate change at USAID is in part figuring out how we can do it inside of USAID systems. You know, I've been there for 2 years and I've very much come to understand that there are a lot of things that aren't necessarily going to change. Where there are opportunities to change some of those things, we certainly should make the effort. But I think also figuring out how to work inside of those systems is really important. I'll just leave it there.
Becky, this is Mike Simonis from ICF International. You set me up perfectly for my question, because so often we focus on the climate risk technical issues that you mentioned in the screening tools and some of the developments that the development banks are addressing or beginning to address. The question I have is really about institutional challenges. So mainstreaming requires institutional change. Watched it take place in the transport and infrastructure world slowly, and watching some of those changes. What challenges do you see in trying to address this from a USAID perspective?
In terms of institutional change, I mean, I think one of the fundamental challenges is part of what we were talking about in terms of timelines, right? And this is something that's changing at USAID. You may be aware of the resilience agenda, for example, which is trying to bring together development assistance with humanitarian assistance and making sure that our humanitarian assistance is not always just reacting to the crisis of the day, but is thinking about how we can escape cycles of crises and think a little bit more longer term, right? But when we talk about climate change, even though we're seeing impacts now, a lot of the issues that we're talking about are longer term than we tend to think about. And I think that's one of the biggest hurdles for us to get over. I think, you know, another hurdle is that, I don't know if this is institutional or not, but climate change is inherently a political issue in the US. And so, you know, we never know what's going to happen with a new administration, with new Congress, et cetera, and kind of making sure that, you know, climate change stays a priority and is something that we can work on. You know, USAID staff are going to follow, you know, have to follow what the direction of the government is. And so, you know, that may or may not change in the future. So that's a challenge. And then I think another challenge is the knowledge base, is the staffing and the knowledge base. And, you know, there's a lot about climate change that is a highly technical issue that scares a lot of people. But a lot of what we need to do in order to address climate change is really not rocket science. You know, it's something that I think a lot of development practitioners can easily incorporate into their work. But when you're talking about thousands of USAID staff, tens of thousands, really what we're talking about, tens of thousands of implementing partners who haven't had to, you know, it's a new issue that we don't necessarily know how to do. I think it's that capacity issue more than anything that's a really big challenge, and that's why training, communications, knowledge management is a really big part of what we're trying to do in order to address mainstreaming at USAID. Of course.
I just wanted to reiterate something I think Becky said earlier too about this, which is the other, I think the big institutional change challenge for all of us who work on mainstreaming is convincing people who have a lot of things they already have to do that this actually is one more thing that's actually important that they need to do. And it's finding a balance between this sort of feeling of compliance and this feeling that you're actually getting better results because of doing this. And so I think USAID, like many big organizations, the mission staff have a lot on their plates. They have a lot of requirements they already comply with. Some of them, I think, would like to know, and I think we're trying to reassure them that this process will try to sort of find that balance between, being a light touch where it can be, but also being meaningful. And I think that's the thing that we certainly need to think through is, how do we find something that actually is not just a box ticking exercise, but that, in some cases doesn't also require a lot of extra work by people who are already really busy. And so I think getting back to somebody's question about, what do you do with the results? Well, we're not saying in every case that there's risk or that the risk is high enough to, necessarily mean you have to rip up your plan or your design and start over. I think it's kind of that range of options that we have to find a good way to communicate to people.
Right. I mean, the last thing that we want is for people to be resentful of the efforts that we put in place to help them improve their development work and consider climate change, right? So that's a big challenge. And I think one of the particular challenges at USAID from an institutional perspective is that there's mainstreaming fatigue. There's a lot of issues that have been, that there's been an effort to mainstream. It's not easy to think about 5 or 6 different issues all at the same time, even if it does improve your development outcomes, et cetera. And there have been all of these processes created that create all of these requirements for the missions. And so as they go through designing their project, they have to do this thing and that thing and this assessment and that assessment. And not that those assessments are bad, but we're kind of now in a period where I think the institution is kind of trying to scale some of that back and have fewer requirements. And so they're really, even though there's a recognition of the importance of climate change, there's a need that, it's a challenge in a time when they're trying to reduce requirements in general to be having areas where they're adding new requirements.
We have another question from online. Wayne White, independent contractor based in Atlanta. Wayne asks, can climate change adaptation leverage cooperation within USAID? For example, land use can be a governance issue as much as agroforestry and community.
Yes, I think that is fundamentally what we're seeing at USAID. I mean, and really in order to be successful at integration, you need to have experts from the different relevant technical areas working together in order to move it forward. It's not realistic to expect one person to have expertise in, I don't remember exactly the examples, land tenure and forestry and, and climate change adaptation and whatever all of the different things might be. But if you can bring different experts together, you can really get a great result. And so I think having those types of integrated teams has been part of our approach. I have no idea.
Ian Fitzsimmons, Still Point Solutions. So global climate change is sort of a quintessentially international problem. And it seems like there's an opportunity, a better than usual opportunity to develop kind of a common integrated international approach, common vocabulary, common conceptual framework. And USAID is relatively well situated to play a leadership role, not only domestically, but among its peers internationally. I wonder if the agency has sort of the attention and the resources to work laterally with its peers as it develops and refines its approach here, and if sort of the president's explicit endorsement strengthens your hand in that respect.
Well, one of the things that I didn't mention that is part of the Executive Order 13677 is that I focused on kind of the bilateral portion of that because that's what USAID tends to do more of. But that executive order also includes requirements for the US government as it engages in multilaterals to help encourage those multilaterals to be integrating climate change considerations into their international development efforts. So that is definitely a part of what we're doing. I think this can also be a part of, there tend to be donor coordination committees, whatever they might be called, in the various countries where we work. And so USAID is likely to participate in those at the mission level. So I think that, at that level, that might be an area, a place where we can do that. And I think that also ties into what the executive order requires us to do, which is to help support the efforts of developing countries to integrate climate change considerations. And yeah, please.
The President announced, I think, 5 things. And, first was the executive order. I think the third or the fourth was a partnership on climate information for development. So we're trying to pull together a consortium of the climate science, delivery folks, and the decision-making community. And we're working on making that an international coalition. So we're trying to get at what you're talking about there. And then Jonathan and I have been working with state and colleagues in other countries on a National Adaptation Plan and Global Network, which Todd Stern announced in Lima. And the idea there is that a lot of us specifically on NAPs, on National Adaptation Plans, both the donor community and the developing countries are pretty new at working on NAPs, and there's a lot of opportunities to short circuit the learning by trial and error and learn by trial and success, and try to share among those. So we're trying to establish a platform for both the donors to communicate with each other and for the developing countries. There are leaders in the Philippines, Jamaica, Malawi that have kind of jumped out front. And we're trying to enable them to share with each other and with us on what work we want to do. So we're trying to get, and also to align our approaches so that if a country develops its plan, we don't then go in and ask for our 8-flavored version of it, and then DFID comes in behind us and asks for a different one and a different one and a different one, but rather try to get to agreement that the country should own the plan, and we should respond to what the country is trying to accomplish, assuming it's in line with the
John, is that partnership called something that people can Google and find out more information about yet, or not quite?
It's called the NAP Global
No.
Network.
Wait,
With
the climate
data
information partner, yeah, the data
that
partnership.
one is, I don't know, it seems like we call it something different every email, but I think that the acronym we did a request for information, and somehow it came out with the acronym CDIRD, I believe, which is Partnership for Climate Information for Resilient Development, International Development.
Someday
So
you'll
if
be
you
able to
Google
find
that,
more information on
you'll
it.
get it. And there was and I don't think I've offended anybody because I don't think anybody realized that it would get shortened to PCDIRD. If you Google that, there is I think there's a web page or something. And there was Kit Batman and Kelly Gallagher from OSTP put out a blog post. You'll eventually make your way to it, and if not, email me. Email my aid address, which has my state address in it, and then forward it to that, and I'll send that link. And then the NAP Global Network.
It's on the White House.
Okay, it's on the White House or the OSTP website. Oh, Jane, and then I'll go to Randy, and then you'll.
Yes, I'm Jane Leggett from the Congressional Research Service, and my question has to do with evaluation, establishing the value of the adaptation. And I apologize, John, but to what degree are AID projects already, do they already take variability in the existing and will you be looking at ways to return that would that help
So I think that climate change variability is something that development practitioners writ large are used to taking into account, at least in certain sectors, like agriculture, for example. And so I think a lot of the efforts, for example, under Food for Peace are able to look at, or have been designed for decades now to be able to be resilient to different types of climate impacts, to droughts, et cetera, right? And so now, what is the new challenge in terms of being able to layer on top of that the shifts that we expect with climate change? And I think in particular, even to the extent that development has taken into account climate variability, I think maybe the difference with climate change is that you know, in the difference with where we are now is being able to bring in climate information in a different way. I mean, yes, I don't think that that development efforts in the past have done a lot to like look at climate change information and pull that in, at least in the ways that we're able to do so now, and particularly looking to the future and what's expected for the future. And so I think that's one of the big challenges from a technical perspective is, you know, being able to make the adjustments in our processes so that we're able to look at those types of things. You want to say something more?
So to a certain extent, the programs that we do are designed around, design is around an assumption of stationary climate. And in some cases, that may be working, and in other cases, it may not be. Where we're starting to address variability is we're supporting index insurance programs, which are focusing at the seasonal time scale, not out in the future. But that gives farmers financial risk management tools that they can take upon themselves to hedge against variability. You know, a season that is beyond the norm for whatever they plan. So, and then we talked about some work we did in Jamaica. Well, we did it in November and then months ago as well, where we're working on developing a seasonal drought forecast to get to farmers. Jamaica does not yet have a financial tool to respond to it, but the farmers can either harvest water, look at irrigation, change what they plant. And over time, as that seasonal forecast gets accepted and as it was developed with Ag Extension. Ag Extension is doing, and Ag Research in Jamaica are doing research on pests under certain different conditions. So they'll couple with the seasonal forecast information on pests to expect under the conditions that are forecast. They'll put out a notice on crops that have in the past thrived under those conditions, and so forth. And then the government is beginning to look for partners who could help them with an index insurance product. So we're looking across timescales, but a lot of what aid invests in is really an asset food security program, and a lot of those decisions are seasonal and annual. As Becky said, we're not a major infrastructure investment, although we got a major infrastructure programs. We make a lot of investments across our education, our health, our cultural programs. Those are, so we're trying to introduce, so the looking at how they're addressing climate across time. We're often just got word we supported a little tool to look at road construction, bringing climate information construction. We're looking for a place to test that. It's fair to say. So anyway, so that's a sense of it, and we can talk with you. So.
Thanks, John. I'm Randy Freed with ICF, and I think there are a number of different ways that you might configure a long-term strategy for adaptation or even climate change in general. But one way that we tend to think of it is that sort of the first phase is mainstreaming, second phase is streamlining, third phase is scaling, fourth phase is validating and adjusting. And so mainstreaming seems to be what USAID has mostly emphasized so far, i.e. figuring out where climate needs to be injected in all the resource management and health decisions that the agency's involved with. Streamlining is a lot harder. It's how do you make the risk assessment and the risk management and the access to finance a lot easier than it currently is. It's currently pretty hard. Scaling, nobody's really been able to do that real effectively so far, at least as far as I can tell. And that's kind of one of the big challenges that we have in the whole field over the next few years. But then the validating and evaluating is basically learning by doing, which brings me to the point at last, which is that arguably USAID is probably in a better position than almost anybody else to learn from programs it's implemented. If you look at your adaptation programs, you guys have probably had on the order of $500 million since 2009 in adaptation. So are you planning, as you develop these processes that AID and MCC and state and ACM and so forth will use, are you planning to do kind of a retrospective program evaluation to learn from the adaptation projects that you've already implemented? And if so, how do you think that evaluation is going to work? Thanks.
I might let John speak to that one, but I am going to, I'll say first off, one of the things that we've already found is that, so USAID doesn't have adaptation programs in all of the missions where we work, right? We only have adaptation programs in 25 countries, right? So, but we've definitely found that in terms of mainstreaming, it's a lot easier to do that in the places where we've had climate change adaptation programs than in other places. And that's, you know, because that there is that experience. It's because it means that we've built up staff who have climate change expertise. And so, you know, that's one of, so for us, in some ways, the first step on that whole phased approach that you talked about was having climate change adaptation programs. And as I said earlier, that's something that we expect to continue doing, but being able to build off of those. And that, I think that relates directly to being able to learn from what we've done in the past.
Yeah, and so we have adaptation funding going in about 25 missions. We've trained, the training team has done a great job. 600 people as of months ago.
700, I think, USAID staff.
The integration piece is going to be tough because that means trying to get the missions and the programs that are not where those people are. So we're trying to figure out how we're going to support that. One of the things that we've done in a few of the trainings was to take the training to the mission rather than come here to some central place. In Jamaica, the mission director asked us to do first day in the mission. I believe she attended, and she told everyone in the mission to be there, the program staff and health people. Went into it thinking, this is environment people, I don't have to go. He said, I want you there. And so then these program ideas started getting out into the rest. On the question of evaluation, We've had a small program going that's looked at, I'm not even sure how many of our programs. And we need to circle back and start doing a better job. I think UCC hasn't had explicit programs yet, but with the rigorous evaluation process. And we'll have to check to lead our we're going to start the cycle over. You had a question? And then I'll go into it.
And I'll also just note one other interesting thing in terms of what John was talking about with the trainings is that we've found that you have a different impact when when you bring people to Washington and they're here for a week or for 2 weeks and they all learn things, and it's one person from the Peru mission and one person from the Ethiopia mission or whatever, and then they go back, and then those people are somehow supposed to get everybody from their mission on board with doing something about climate change. Like these other people who have no idea what they're talking about, etc. And going to a mission like Jamaica and doing a training of 20 to 30 people from across the whole mission and all of the different sectors, including program office staff who are dealing with the budgets and all those types of things, and really building up teams of people who can do something about climate change and who can work together. It's just a fundamentally different type of capacity in terms of their ability to do something moving forward. Now, obviously, this is something we struggle with because there are a lot of USAID missions, and it's a lot of effort for us to go to take a training team to a mission and do, we're not going to be able to get to all the missions in the next year or two, but it has had a very different impact, and I think that's something worth noting. Please. Yes?
Hi, I'm Mark Goldberg with the Urban Institute. Thanks for this briefing. Two quick questions. One of the 35 action steps in climate adaptation is an aspiration to have a person in each mission who's charged with climate change information, responsibilities. Wondering what the prognosis is on that. And two, you alluded to the interagency working group that you all are chairing with Treasury, and I'm just wondering if you could give us a little bit of an update on the early stages of the work of the working group and where that's headed.
So, yeah, one of our aspirations is to have a point of contact in each mission that's responsible for climate change. I don't know where that's going to land yet, and it is a challenge. There are caps for the number of people that can be in missions. It doesn't necessarily imply that we would be, that there would be brand new people whose job it was to address climate change. The gender experience, for example, is oftentimes that, it's just something that's loaded on top of all of their other duties, and oftentimes it's the last person in the door who gets assigned to be that point of contact. Is that better than nothing? Probably. So, we're exploring what the opportunities are and how to do that in the best way. And, it may not be possible at every mission. Maybe it's possible in the regional missions. So we're figuring out what exactly might be possible. But we do think that having people who have this in their job descriptions, and maybe that's not one point of contact, but recognizing that people, even though they work on health or even though they work on agriculture or whatever, should, when it comes time for their performance appraisal, be asked, well, did you think about climate change and how did you address this? There's a lot of different ways to think about this, but we recognize that formalizing it to some extent can be really helpful. In terms of the interagency working group, I don't know that there's that much that's interesting to report. We are kind of bungling along through that process just the same way that we are at USAID in terms of figuring out what this means, et cetera. And the goal of the interagency process is to support the sorting out what type of climate change information is available, looking at what experiences been in other places. Potentially that interagency process will be providing guidelines for kind of minimum standards for what these processes should look like at each agency. But obviously there's a lot of challenges to doing that simultaneously with each of the agencies figuring this out, and all of us aiming to have something in place by October. But I think it's, you know, it's really great that the agencies are working together and learning from each other and supporting each other so that not everybody is reinventing the wheel. And that's basically how it's working so far.
So Joel, and then it's getting close to the end of time, so why don't we make this the last question, and then we can, if there's any informal chat, we can do that.
Last one, all right. So I'm Joel Smith from Stratus Consulting, and thanks for the presentation. So I have a question about the diffusion of adaptation in terms of measuring or getting a sense of how it's working and all. I'm assuming, and I'm not an expert on diffusion, but some people will get it right away and will dive right in. Some will probably struggle. They might eventually figure it out or not, and others may not care or not get it. And I'm just wondering if this is thought through in terms of what's, you know, how you might work with different people in terms of how they, you know, those that do get it quickly, those who lag, and is there any sense of what's success in this in terms of, I mean, does everybody in the agency need to be, you know, addressing, you know, climate change every time with every decision, or half the people, or any sense of that?
I don't have an answer to that last part right now. You know, we're still in early days, and as we've been talking about, we do have a training program, and we do evaluations related to that training program, and I think we're just now starting to get to the point of being able to understand how much people have actually implemented, what it is that they have learned, and what's helped them to do so, and what hasn't helped them to do so. So that's something that we're starting to look at. And we definitely have tried to design our training program to be focused on behavior change as much as possible. So it's not designed to just give people information about climate change or as like a graduate course or something like that. The whole goal of the training program is to be able to help people do their job differently. And so we do try to utilize a lot of adult learning techniques, et cetera, to really improve that diffusion, but I don't have specific answers to your question about what works and what doesn't, and especially on the side of the individual, what different individuals and what works better for certain individuals or not. I mean, one thing that we are trying to do is have trainings that are tailored to sectors as much as possible, because people are going to engage in a very different way the more relevant the content is for them. So actually just this morning, we did a 1.5-hour webinar on climate change and health, and we had people dial in from all over the world to learn specifically about how climate change relates to health, and we'll be doing a follow-up webinar on that too that's going to take it to that next level in terms of what is it that you can actually do. But there's a lot of content development that goes into looking at all of those specific sectors and needs and whatever. So we're doing the best we can on it. I guess that's it.
All right.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you, everybody. Next, let's see, February is Brent McCusker talking about lessons, what did he call it? Hindcasting. Looking back at what people he's working in Malawi have done in response to a previous drought, previous flood situation, whatever, to see how they reacted as a way of informing adaptation options going forward. Please come. And then in March, it's a whole week of this. So join us for as much of it as you can. I think you've all gotten the invitation. If you didn't, let Lily know. And thank you for coming.